Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hey, welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great show for you tonight. Mr. Michael Kravitz, guest several times in the past, will be on again tonight. He's been working with the World Health Organization on descheduling cannabis at an international level and taking it out of international treaties. He also has been working with the United Nations Drug Control Policy Commission, the group of other academics and professionals, and he has spearheaded the availability of medical marijuana to veterans through the VA hospital and is continuing to work on allowing veterans to use it directly at the VA hospital. We're not quite there yet. But we'll be talking more with Michael in just a minute. We have an extensive hemp news segment for you tonight. There's a lot of news on the election, medical news, so stay tuned as we bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first hemp news story tonight concerns the election this week. This election, Americans will once again show their support for marijuana legalization. Millions of Americans will head to the polls in the coming days, if you haven't voted already, which I have, and cast votes on whether or not to legalize the use of marijuana in their states. If passed as precedent, most, if not all, of these statewide ballot measures will be enacted into law. Beginning with California in 1996, voters in multiple jurisdictions nationwide have voted well over 24 times on Election Day in favor of marijuana legalization measures. Currently, 34 states and the District of Columbia have laws on the books regulating the production and dispensing of medical cannabis to qualified patients. 11 of these states, encompassing 1/4 of the United States population, have also legalized the possession and use of marijuana by anyone over the age of 21. In 9 of these 11 states, adult use legalization measures were enacted by a direct vote of the people. About half of all statewide medical cannabis laws were enacted via voter initiative. This long and consistent history of success at the ballot box should hardly be surprising. According to nationwide polling data compiled by Gallup, 2/3 of Americans, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, believe that marijuana consumption by adults ought to be legal in the United States. On the issue of legalizing cannabis for medical use, support's even stronger. National polling data compiled by Quinnipiac University found that 91% of voters believe that adults should access and use medical marijuana when their physician approves it. Despite this public consensus, elected officials have far too often remained unresponsive to the legalization issue. With only a handful of exceptions, in Illinois and Vermont, rarely are they willing to expend the political capital necessary to advance the issue legislatively, particularly with respect to legalizing the adult use marijuana market. In Vermont, the legislature passed it twice. The governor vetoed it. New governor came in, didn't sign it, but allowed it to go into law just last week. This dereliction of duty has forced advocacy groups to directly place the marijuana-related ballot question before the voters, something they have now done successfully in every election dating back over 2 decades, since 1996. Tellingly, voters have yet to express any buyer's remorse following this decision. To date, no state that has legalized cannabis for either therapeutic use or for adult use purposes has ever repealed their law. According to available polls, voters residing in jurisdictions where cannabis is legal consistently report that legalization has been a success in their state and that regulated marijuana is preferable to criminalization. In many of those states that initially legalized cannabis for medical purposes only, the electorate later voted to expand these regulatory schemes to include all adults. This election, Voters in 4 additional states, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota, will weigh in on whether to legalize marijuana use and sales for adults, while 2 states, Mississippi and South Dakota, will decide on the issue of medical use. In each of these states, initial polls show solid support among voters for these ballot measures, despite, in some cases, the expressed opposition of those in positions of leadership. For example, as of this writing, Proposition 207 in Arizona holds a percentage lead of nearly 20 points among likely voters, much to the chagrin of Republican Governor Doug Ducey, who's spoken out staunchly against it, while New Jersey's Question 1 holds a 3-to-1 lead with likely voters. In South Dakota, internal polling compiled by a group opposed to legalization acknowledged majority support among voters for both initiative efforts for medical and for adult use, with some 70% of South Dakotans supporting medicalization and a majority backing full legalization. This support comes despite public statements by Republican Governor Kristi Noem opposing both efforts. Of course, voters have been consistently defying their elected officials on this issue for more than 2 decades, and no doubt most likely will do so again next week. Ideally, though, these ballot campaign efforts should no longer be necessary. The public has spoken loudly and clearly. They favor jettisoning the failed policies of marijuana prohibition and replacing it with a policy of legalization, regulation, taxation, and public education. Their elected officials at both the state and federal level ought to be listening. In South Dakota, statewide polling data compiled last week shows that 3 out of 4 South Dakota voters support a ballot measure to legalize medical cannabis access in the state, but that only 51% back a separate amendment to regulate the adult use market. The poll, conducted by Mason-Dixon Polling and Strategy, finds that 74% of respondents intend to vote yes on Initiative Measure 26, which establishes a medical cannabis access program in South Dakota. By contrast, fewer likely voters express their support for Constitutional Amendment A, which legalizes the use, production, and retail sale of cannabis for adults. Pollsters reported that 51% of likely voters backed the measure, with 44% opposed and 5% undecided. Voters in Arizona, Montana, and New Jersey will also decide on adult use legalization ballot initiatives next week on Election Day, while voters in Mississippi will decide between 2 dueling measures specific to regulating medical cannabis use. Similar to recent poll results from Arizona and Montana, support for the South Dakota amendment is strongly partisan. Among South Dakota's Democrats, 73% expressed their intent to vote yes for full legalization, as do 58% of independents. By contrast, only 34% of Republicans back legalization. Under South Dakota law, the possession of any amount of marijuana is a Class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail, a $2,000 fine, and a criminal record. In 2018, an estimated 1 out of every 10 arrests made in South Dakota was marijuana related, according to data compiled by the campaign proponents, South Dakotans for Better Marijuana Laws. 95% of all cannabis arrests in South Dakota were for possession. According to an analysis of marijuana arrest data compiled by the ACLU, Black Americans in South Dakota are 5 times more likely than whites to be arrested for possessing cannabis. Both statewide measures are opposed by South Dakota's Republican Governor Kristi Noem, who recently appeared in a televised ad spot speaking out against them. There's a new 2-part documentary out on the Sundance Channel. It's called The Dakota Entrapment. It talks about a 20-year-old student at North Dakota State College who was arrested by campus police for 2 sales of marijuana, one for $20, one for $60, and he was forced to become an informant on behalf of the Dakota Police Department there. He was found murdered, strapped with rocks in his back, dumped in a river, and a bullet to his head. This is the result of marijuana prohibition. So check out this new documentary on the Sundance Now channel. It's called The Dakota Entrapment Tapes. Last week's final presidential debate between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden was notable in that neither man rushed to the defense of America's tendency to throw people in jail to serve long sentences for crimes even if both men have records of wanting to do so. Biden reiterated his position on the drug war that rather than arresting and imprisoning people for drug use, these people should be helped via drug courts and mandatory drug treatment. Biden also claimed that Republicans don't support drug courts, which isn't true. President George W. Bush's national drug control strategy touted the local use of drug courts. Biden probably thinks he's advocating for something good, as do the Democrats, who included this position in the party's 2020 platform, which says that nobody should be incarcerated, quote, solely because they use drugs, end quote, and instead calls for diversionary treatment and drug courts. The problem is that this position is simply perpetuating the drug war, but in a way that seems kindly and more accommodating. It operates on the incorrect assumption that every single person who uses illegal drugs is an addict who needs intervention in order to stop. Biden's view, to be fair, could be influenced by his experience with his son Hunter's struggle with addiction to cocaine. But the drug court system is overly reliant on the threat of incarceration as part of its very operating system. Drug courts often require that anybody who wants to the mercy of the court plead guilty, giving up their rights and confess to an addiction, one they may not have, in order to avoid jail. Look at this description from a 2007 drug court supervised drug diversion program in Harris County, Texas, which is actually my birthplace, called Success Through Addiction Recovery, or STAR, praised by the Bush administration. The report brags about the fact that some people find participating in the drug court to be harsher than incarceration and turn it down. It's a highly structured 3-phase treatment program. STAR involves 12-step programs or approved alternatives, group and individual treatment, and counseling programs, frequent random drug testing, and regular interaction with the judges. Although designed to last at least 12 months, there's no automatic graduation from the STAR program. To graduate and successfully re-enter society, participants must take certain positive steps to become drug and crime-free, including demonstrating continued sobriety through drug testing and getting an education or attaining gainful employment. Even after graduation from the program, STAR clients must participate in aftercare for a minimum of another 12 months. Graduates must continue to report to a case manager who monitors their sobriety, and successful discharge is determined on a case-by-case basis. The report says, quote, the folks of STAR must be doing something right, end quote. But subsequent research of drug court operations has shown that in reality, drug courts in some cities have led to increased police crackdown on drug users. A report from 2018 from the nonprofit Social Science Research Council examined drug court systems in the United States and Latin America and found that in many cities, the existence of drug courts actually drove up arrests for simple drug possession. And because these drug courts are so demanding, as the STAR program bragged, people sometimes fail to comply. When they fail, they end up in jail, the very place these programs are supposed to be diverting from. The 2018 report found that in New York City, people who failed drug court ended up with jail sentences higher than those who just pled guilty and didn't bother with diversion at all. When it comes down to it, forcing everybody found to be using drugs into drug courts and treatment is putting a gloss of false kindness and caring on a harsh government system of mandates that punishes people not for harming others or for their property, but for what they do with their own bodies. Mandatory drug treatment means that these policies Biden supports, and Trump does too, must be backed up with additional penalties for those who aren't cooperative. People who are addicted and do need assistance generally should be able to seek out help, and government social services could be useful there. Drug courts might be a useful tool for approaching those with harsh addictions and have led them to commit other crimes as well. But a system where the drug use itself still brings with it a threat of punishment is not a system that's ending the drug war. It's an admirable of Biden not to abandon his son Hunter to addiction and to continue to love him and try to help him as needed, but he's also attempting to force policies on everybody that may not be as bad as the mass incarceration of the 1980s and 90s, but nevertheless still perpetuates the failed war on drugs. Here in Oregon, we have Measure 110, which will end all drug criminalization, and I voted yes on that. Next story is from Washington, D.C. 9 members of Congress sent a letter to the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, on Tuesday, urging the agency to revise its proposed hemp regulations. The DEA released an interim final rule, or IFR, for the crop in August and said that the regulations were simply meant to comply with the 2018 Farm Bill that legalized hemp and its derivatives. But stakeholders and advocates have expressed serious concerns about certain proposals, arguing that they could put processors at risk of violating federal law and hamper the industry's growth. Representative David Joyce, a Republican from Ohio, and Denver Riggleman, a Republican from Vermont, led the letter and pointed specifically to a provision of the DEA's report that could impact processing hemp extracts. The agency stipulated that, quote, any such material that contains greater than 0.3 of 1% of Delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis remains controlled in Schedule 1, end quote. That's problematic, the lawmakers said, because in many cases the process of extracting cannabinoids from hemp temporarily causes THC levels to increase beyond that threshold. And so, while Congress intended to legalize those extracts, businesses that produce the material could find themselves inadvertently breaking the law. The lawmaker's letter states, quote, our offices have received countless calls from constituents involved in the hemp industry who are extremely fearful that simply following the provisions of the Farm Bill will result in criminal liability under this proposal. The IFR will likely have the effect of inhibiting these nascent state hemp programs, thereby harming those American companies and workers who choose to pursue careers in the hemp industry and made significant investments to effectuate those aspirations, end quote. Therefore, the lawmakers are, quote, requesting a resolution on this issue as quickly as possible. The DEA must revise the IFR to eliminate the ambiguities set forth above and provide peace of mind to all Americans who've chosen to pursue a career in the hemp industry, end quote. Representative Rodney Davis of Illinois, Morgan Griffith of Virginia, Glenn Grotham of Wisconsin, Don Young of Alaska, Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio, our own River City, Portland, Oregon, Earl Blumenauer, and Matt Geitz of Florida also signed the letter. A public comment period on the DEA's proposed rules closed last week. It saw more than 3,300 submissions, many of which focused on issues with work-in-process hemp THC issues. One commentator wrote, quote, this IFR criminalizes work-in-progress hemp extract, a fundamental component of any consumer hemp CBD product, and will negatively impact the hemp CBD industry at a time when financial pressure is already high. Hemp and subsequent extracts are not controlled substances, end quote. Another issue identified by more than 1,000 commenters concerns Delta-8 THC. The most widely known cannabinoid is Delta-9 THC, the main component responsible for creating the intoxicating effect. But Delta-8 THC from hemp is also psychoactive and is the object of growing interest within the market. It's often in those hemp extract pens. Because DEA's proposed regulations state that all synthetically derived tetrahydrocannabinols remain Schedule 1 controlled substances, some feel that would directly impact the burgeoning cannabinoid as it's converted from CBD through the use of a catalyst, and that could be interpreted as a synthetic production process. In any case, it's not clear whether DEA deliberately crafted either of these rules with the intent of criminalizing certain hemp producers, but stakeholders and advocates aren't taking any chances. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, has faced separate criticism over its own proposed hemp rules, though it's been more proactive in addressing them. Following significant pushback from the industry over certain regulations it views as excessively restrictive, the agency reopened a public comment period, which also closed this month. USDA is also planning to distribute a national survey to gain insights from thousands of hemp businesses that could inform its approach to regulating this market. Our next story is from Pullman, Washington. The inhalation of herbal cannabis is associated with temporary reductions in the symptoms of OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, according to data published in the Journal of Affective Disorders. A team of investigators affiliated with Washington State University analyzed data from 87 subjects who self-identified as suffering from OCD. Study participants used a smartphone application to track the severity of their symptoms immediately before and shortly following their use of cannabis over a 31-month period. The authors reported, quote, using a large data set of medical cannabis users self-medicating for symptoms of OCD, we found that for the vast majority of cannabis use sessions, individuals reported reductions in intrusions or unwanted thoughts or impulses, compulsions, and anxiety. The results indicated that after inhaling cannabis, ratings of intrusions were reduced by 49%, compulsions by 60%, and anxiety by 52%, end quote. Decreases in compulsive behavior were most closely associated with the consumption of cannabis containing higher concentrations of CBD. The authors concluded, quote, results from the present study indicate that inhaled cannabis may acutely reduce symptoms of OCD. While the symptom severity ratings were reduced by approximately 50 to 60% from immediately before to after cannabis use, there is evidence that cannabis-associated reductions in intrusions may diminish over time. Collectively, these results indicate that cannabis may have short-term but not long-term beneficial effects on the symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, end quote. Few studies have assessed the potential efficacy of cannabis for the mitigation of symptoms of OCD. As such, these findings, though somewhat limited by the study's design, indicate that cannabis, and in particular varieties high in CBD, hold promise as a therapeutic option for obsessive-compulsive disorder, and should be further examined in a more rigorously designed controlled setting. This study, Acute Effects of Cannabis on Symptoms of Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, appears in this month's edition of the Journal of Affective Disorders. Our next story is from Canada. Many of the patients enrolled in Canada's medical cannabis program report reducing their alcohol intake, according to data published in the International Journal of Drug Policy. A team of researchers with the Canadian Institute for Substance Abuse and the University of Victoria School of Public Health and Social Policy surveyed nearly 1,000 federally authorized medical cannabis patients. The survey participants reported on their use of alcohol prior to and following their enrollment in Canada's Medical Cannabis Access Program. The investigators reported that 44% of respondents reported decreases in alcohol frequency following their participation in the Cannabis Access Program. Of those, 85% reported decreasing the number of drinks they consumed per week, while 18% reported consuming no alcohol during the 30-day period prior to taking the survey. Those respondents who were younger than 55 years of age or who were engaged in higher rates of alcohol consumption prior to their enrollment were most likely to report either reducing or ceasing their use of alcohol. The authors concluded, quote, our findings suggest that medical cannabis initiation may be associated with self-reported reductions in cessation of alcohol use among medical cannabis patients. Since alcohol is the most prevalent recreational substance in North America and its use results in significant rates of criminality, morbidity, and mortality, these findings may result in improved health outcomes for medical cannabis patients, as well as overall improvements in public health and safety, end quote. The findings are consistent with other studies reporting that many patients limit their use of alcohol following their enrollment in medical cannabis access programs. By contrast, other studies of non-patients report mixed results with respect to whether alcohol and cannabis are likely to act as either potential substitutes or complements. This study, Reductions in Alcohol Use Following Medical Cannabis Initiation, results from a large cross-sectional survey of medical cannabis patients in Canada, appears in this month's edition of the Journal of International Drug Policy. The next story is from Illinois. Available evidence indicates that cannabis can improve neurological symptoms associated with Huntington's disease. And therefore, physicians ought to consider authorizing it for certain patients suffering from Huntington's disease, according to a study in the Journal of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. A team of investigators affiliated with the St. James School of Medicine in Illinois reviewed 22 studies, including 5 randomized placebo-controlled trials, assessing the efficacy of either cannabinoids or herbal cannabis for the alleviation of symptoms of Huntington's disease and other related movement disorders. Of the studies included for review, the authors determined that, quote, the majority of them showed statistically significant results favoring the use of medical cannabis, especially for improving motor symptoms and quality of sleep, end quote. The authors concluded that additional clinical trials are warranted, but also recommended that in the interim, quote, physicians consider prescribing medical marijuana as adjunctive treatment for symptomatic relief to slow the progression or reverse spasms, tremor, spasticity, chorea, dystonia, behavioral, neuropsychiatric, and sleep disturbances in patients with Huntington's disease, end quote. According to the Mayo Clinic, no FDA-approved medications are currently available to mitigate the physical, mental, and behavioral decline associated with Huntington's disease. This study, Medical Marijuana Effect in Movement Disorders, Focus on Huntington's Disease, a literature review, appears in this month's edition of the Journal of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. Our last story tonight concerns our older population. 15% of seniors report having used cannabis products within the past 3 years, primarily for therapeutic purposes, according to data published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. Investigators affiliated with the University of California at San Diego surveyed 568 respondents at a geriatric clinic in Southern California. All of the study's participants were at least 65 years of age, and 73% of the respondents were older than 75 years. 15% of those surveyed reported consuming either cannabis or CBD within the past 3 years. Over half of those who responded affirmatively reported using cannabis products either daily or weekly. 78% of those consumers described their use as medical, primarily to mitigate pain, improve sleep, or to reduce anxiety. Some 3/5 of users in the survey acknowledged initiating their use of cannabis products as older adults. Fewer than half of all elderly consumers reported ever having spoken to their healthcare provider about their cannabis use. It's not surprising that a rising percentage of seniors considers cannabis to be a viable therapeutic option in their later years. Many seniors struggle with pain, anxiety, restless sleep, and other conditions for which cannabis products may mitigate. Moreover, many seniors are well aware of the litany of serious adverse side effects associated with available prescription drugs like opioids or sleep aids, and they perceive medical cannabis to be a practical and potentially safer alternative. Several recent studies have similarly reported that marijuana use is growing in popularity among older adults. Other studies have determined that medical cannabis use by seniors is relatively safe and effective at mitigating pain and improving self-reported quality of life. The study's authors concluded, quote, our study has augmented what is known about cannabis use in older adults by identifying distinct patterns and characteristics of cannabis use among them, with older adult cannabis users using cannabis primarily for medical reasons and to treat specific conditions. Most older adults in these samples initiated cannabis use after the age of 60 years and used it primarily for medical purposes to treat pain, sleep disturbances, anxiety, or depression. Cannabis use by older adults is likely to increase due to medical need, favorable legalization, and attitudes, end quote. This story is available online at the website for the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. That's the end of our Hemp News segment tonight. Stay tuned. We've got Michael Kravitz coming up, and go out and vote and restore hemp. Good night.
In a way, my attitude is, we can complain and blame the bad guys, and we can cry around a lot about how they're not fair and things like that, but that's who they are.
Always been that way.
All right, and that's just plain simple reality.
It is what it is.
And I just think when I look at hemp, I'm specifically towards hemp, is like they were mentioning earlier about the California Proposition 19. If that passes, see, then that's also inclusive of hemp.
Yeah, it is.
And, so there's kind of a major thing kind of happening around that part of it. But anyways, I was going to say about the hemp thing, the only thing I would add is, is like the people that really are seriously environmentally oriented, I think that there should be serious consideration of hemp.
Mm-hmm.
It's just at least check it out.
Yeah, I
Check
think
it
that's
out
the whole
and
reason
understand
it's
it.
illegal.
And then No, the reason hemp is illegal is because, you know, marijuana was made illegal in the first place to shut down hemp.
Exactly.
That's why it was made illegal. They went after hemp through marijuana.
That's correct.
Well, now marijuana's starting to come back in, so now bring hemp back in. The same way they went after it, let's bring it back in that way. But the marijuana prohibition had everything to, it didn't have anything to do with getting high on pot. It had everything to do with hemp. Cutting down the forest and the petrochemical now going to the oil stuff, all of this had fallen into place. You know, so, yeah, but anyway, so I think people that are seriously considering about being environmentalist, and I'm not challenging anything they're doing, I'm just saying, hey, if you're for real about the environment, this is earth medicine. It's renewable, it's earth medicine, you know, and it just plain and simply is. To the medical marijuana people, let's say, all right, well, we went and we're getting the medicine for ourselves, now let's come back and get it for the earth, because, you know, she's the one that's giving us our medicine in the first place. But see, I'm saying out of all of this, and out of the hemp marijuana people, we should be the ones that show our dedicated loyalty to the earth. All right, and hemp is, yeah, I mean, it's well, anyway, you know, it's it's productive and it doesn't harm the earth. You don't need the pesticides, you don't need the chemicals, realities.
Yeah, it helps regenerate the soil.
I'd like to welcome Michael Kravitz from the World Health Organization lobbying effort right now. I know that's what you wanted to talk to about, but Michael, you've worn so many hats over the years. You've helped veterans establish veteran rights at the VA hospital for medical marijuana patients. I know you've been working in Vienna at the United Nations and with Normal on so many different things, but you contacted me just now to talk about the World Health Organization, which I'm ashamed to say, you know, our current administration, as we're filming this, says they're going to pull us out of. What's going on?
Well, the ball in play is actually at the United Nations, but the United Nations is voting on the World Health Organization recommendations. So for the last 5 years or so, we've been working with the strange world cannabis movement, working with the World Health Organization, but we have working with them to come out with a new platform, a new understanding of cannabis based on today's evidence, based on today's knowledge. The previous World Health Organization recommendations and statements on cannabis as a medicine were like 50 years old, and we're very much against cannabis as a medicine, really calling it what it's treated like all over the world, a very highly dangerous drug with very little knowledge about its use, to be treated only as a research substance. And
it's Schedule 1. So
right.
Schedule 1 means it has no medicinal value, and that was spearheaded by the United States initially. Wasn't it in the Single Convention Treaty or in the United Nations Treaty on Psychotropic Substances?
Yeah, so the United States is where cannabis is in Schedule 1, and where Schedule 1 means that it has no accepted medical value. And that's going to be an important thing to remember in a minute, because I swear to you, the guys that went over to the treaty level, and it was the same guy, Harry Anslinger, from the 1930s. By the 1960s, he was our ambassador to the UN, Harry Anslinger. And I'm sure that the confusion that comes about because of the way the numbers are different in the treaty and in the US law are intended. I'm sure it's intended. But anyway, that's a side note. The thing is that the World Health Organization has reversed its position, and now it has come out with a very clear position in favor of cannabis as a medical use, in favor of medical use of cannabis, acknowledging that it has traditional use out in the field, even in its whole flower cannabis preparations, not just pharmaceuticals. And that was an important thing, because they could have just come out and said, oh, Sativex is okay and nothing else is. And had we not given any input, that very well might have been what happened. But we worked with them and brought in an amazing amount of resources from around the world, all the evidence, everything that we basically know, all the knowledge that we've gained on cannabis being delivered to patients in the pharmacies and in the dispensaries from all over the world. We brought all that knowledge as crystallized as we could. Our little team brought it together and presented to them in Geneva, Switzerland. And out of Geneva, Switzerland comes a set of recommendations that are actually pretty bold. They're not as far as maybe some of our activists would have liked them to go, but they're pretty darn bold recommendations that would normalize cannabis as a medicine in the treaty. And where the Schedule 1 in the United States lines up with the treaty is mostly in the Schedule 4 in the treaty. Like I said, they made it purposefully confusing, but that is quite what it lines up to, the Schedule 4. And this recommendation removes cannabis from Schedule 4, leaving it in the status that's, again, pretty confusing by the number, but in reality, it's rather easy to understand. It's basically being thrown in with all the other medicines that are in the treaty, which are basically your narcotics and stimulants and hallucinogens and things like that. So it's still in the treaty. It still wouldn't be removed from the treaty, which is what I think the World Health Organization had a recommendation along those lines, but didn't want to go that far because they're given the mandate inside the treaty to schedule drugs, to look at the evidence and figure out where it should be placed appropriately in schedules. The treaty was written around cannabis. It was written around cannabis, coca, and poppy. So if you want to actually remove cannabis from the treaty, you're going to need to take out a pen and paper and rewrite the treaty. It's not going to be just a simple change in schedule. And the World Health Organization made that pretty clear on both levels. They said cannabis really doesn't belong in with all these other narcotics and stuff, but that would be a rewrite of the treaty to do that. We suggest you do that. That's essentially what they did. Some of our activists in Vienna have actually complained about that. We don't. We're like on the side, my team is on the side of the WHO here and really feels like it's a pragmatic, recommendation. If they had gone a whole bunch further, what would be the likelihood of the UN actually accepting it? And that vote is scheduled in December for that acceptance or denial of these recommendations.
How does that vote look, or is there any way to gauge the potential vote?
Sure. We've been tracking this. Actually, you can find some great documentation. My team member at the very highest level that's been really helping me the most, Kenzie Ribulet-Zamuli out of Barcelona, has produced a bunch of documentation that we've all worked on. The Crimson Digest is probably the best document. You just type right into Google, the Crimson Digest, World Health Organization, cannabis, whatever you want, into Google, and it'll pull it right up, and you can read all about the treaty. You can read all about the recommendations, what they do, who the countries are that are going to vote on it. It's 53 countries that have this vote in December, and out of those 53, we're looking at it, and it looks possible. It doesn't look like a done deal, but it certainly looks possible. One of the things that's been confusing is we have a lot of countries out there that are adamantly opposed to cannabis, and they're very vocal about it. Russia probably gets the merit badge for the most vocally against any cannabis reform whatsoever. Nigeria has also been very vocal, but these very vocal opponents are actually a small number, and we have actually a pretty large number of countries that have well-established cannabis programs, whether it's medical programs or state level regulated access programs, and they're very quiet. It's important to understand that up till now, it's really been these anti-marijuana countries that's been vocal, and these very pro-cannabis countries have been quiet, leading bystanders or observers to feel like it might be even harder for this vote to win than it really is. The only problem with that, it motivates people to vote and to participate, I suppose. But in this forum, in these diplomatic circles, I don't want countries to think this is a done deal and it's not going to win. That's certainly not the case. It certainly can. And if they think it can, that's probably the biggest hurdle to actually it winning.
So is this vote in the United Nations General Assembly in New York?
No, actually, the drug policy stuff. The drug policy stuff that the UN does is handled on a year-to-year basis in Vienna, Austria. Yeah, and the agency that oversees this, it's given the authority from New York, to do these drug policy meetings on an annual basis, and it's called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And that commission, again, is 53 countries that have this voting. And one of the key things about this World Health Organization stuff from the very beginning, inside the United Nations, when you want to change something in drug policy, it has to be done by consensus. All the resolutions that are put forward in Vienna are all by consensus. And as you might imagine, finding consensus on drug policy, especially for reform, would be a big uphill battle. But the World Health Organization is actually written into the treaty process as the expert source of these scheduling recommendations. So when the World Health Organization comes back to Vienna from Geneva and they give their recommendations, it's just a simple majority vote. And that makes it doable. That makes it entirely possible that we'll win in December, is because, especially for this 1961 treaty, it's just a simple majority vote to pass the changes into policy.
So Russia is one of the big opponents. What was the other one? Did you say Hungary?
Nigeria.
Nigeria. Okay. Russia is a traditional hemp producer. I don't know about Nigeria, but it's
You brought,
usually a tool of social repression in terms of cannabis policy. How
well,
does the United States stack up in this? Has the Trump administration had any influence there?
Interestingly, the United States has been a very strong participant in this process. And this is a really strange situation. Okay, so on an annual basis, the World Health Organization has been coming, at least for the last 5 years, every year with a whole package of drugs that they've looked at the merits of the science and have made recommendations. Most of them are incredibly dangerous drugs that they're actually putting into control, like fentanyl analogs and stuff. And then these deliberations on these addition to control are like 5 minutes. The WHO comes up, they make a quick presentation, the countries think about it for a minute, they vote yes, and they move on. So the World Health Organization comes back with a cannabis recommendation that goes the other way, makes a couple of recommendations that actually remove some of the crazy sanction prohibition type language that was created long ago without any evidence. And what do? They put it into this huge process. It's been 2 years at the commission, having meeting after meeting after meeting. Some of these meetings are high level summit, basically meetings, international cannabis summit, where the World Health Organization has spent hour after hour after hour answering very detailed questions of countries about cannabis. I can tell you that all the members of this commission have been reading and do their homework, reading not just the treaty, but the commentary to the treaty, which some of these folks maybe have never read before. But that's where this really goes. Again, because cannabis is so embedded in the treaty, the ramifications of rescheduling are actually quite large, and the countries are giving it a lot of thought. And the United States has been leading this effort. They've been asking the tough questions. They've been out there and telling us, very openly, that they're asking questions to try to help everyone understand this. So they're not just looking at it from the United States perspective, but they're trying to be sort of a team player and working with the entire commission to try to find a resolution on this. And to be very clear about all this, cannabis is a medicine. How it is treated as a medicine throughout the world. It has nothing to do with hemp. Hemp is completely exempt from control under the treaty. It has nothing to do with non-medical use or so-called recreational use or adult use, which is important to understand, is not defined anywhere in the treaty. There's nowhere in the treaty that it says adult use or recreational use is illegal. In fact, it says industrial use is legal. So tell that to our cannabis industry.
So this vote's coming up in December, and there's no way at this point, really. Have there been any advocates? The United States, you say, is playing a neutral role. Traditionally, the United States has been the driver behind marijuana criminalization. It was Harry Anslinger that pushed prohibition here in the United States, and the first drug control policies that were embedded in the United Nations back under Eisenhower. So who is it are any nations advocating for these changes?
The way that I would like, and probably you would like to see advocating for these changes, probably not. There probably isn't anybody. But a couple of things of note, like for example, I've been going to these meetings for 20 years now. And the first time I've ever seen the Netherlands really stand up and talk about their medical program and how it works and how it works well, that was very recent in one of these meetings that they had deliberating these recommendations. The countries like Mexico and Colombia, Uruguay, Jamaica, all get merit badges for good presentations and strong support. There hasn't been any real cheerleaders for the recommendations, but I know Switzerland is working very hard to try to create transparency and to make sure that this process is well thought through, because there's a lot of devil in the details in how the vote is actually presented. This is 6 recommendations, even in the order that they're placed, because 1 or 2 of the recommendations are based on the result of other recommendations. You know what I mean?
What are the specific recommendations? There are 6 recommendations. What are those? Can you outline
Yeah.
those?
Yeah, sure. Off the top of my head. So the biggest one, as I said, is removal from Schedule 4. The way cannabis is placed in the treaty, and again, totally opposite from the U.S., and it kind of screws up your head. So actually, probably better to run through the numbers real quick, just in a very, very fast way, just so you know the difference. So in the treaty, basically everything's thrown into Schedule 1. Basically, all the poppy and coca and morphine and heroin and everything are in Schedule 1. If it's in Schedule 1/Schedule 4, then it's like heroin and cannabis and a few other things and that combination, Schedule 1/Schedule 4, is that onerous drug war combination that in and of itself recommends a very careful application of these drugs, mostly as in scientific use. That's that 1/4. So removing it from Schedule 4 diffuses that and leaves it left like any other medicine. And then because it was in Schedule 1/4, there was also another bit of language in Schedule 1 about tinctures and extracts. Now, if you remove it from Schedule 4, that tinctures and extracts language in Schedule 1 has no meaning anymore, because there would be no 1/4 onerous thing to keep out of. They were trying to keep tinctures and extracts out of that prohibition kind of control. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. That's that little tiny window that Sativex and with their nabiximols kind of went through. And if you wonder how they've been able to promote that around the world as a very legal drug with very little international problems, that's why, because it's been considered Schedule 1 and not Schedule 1/4 because of that special tinctures and extracts. And then what they recommend in the end is to have it 1/3. So, okay, the schedule numbers are 1, 2, 3, and 4. I already talked about 1 and 4. 2 and 3 are kind of interesting because basically, if it's a little bit less dangerous, you can put it in Schedule 2. If it's a whole lot less dangerous, you can put it in Schedule 3. So in Schedule 1/3, which is what the World Health Organization is recommending, that would allow for cannabis to be treated, kind of like anything else, fairly strong control, like poppy or coca or whatever. But it could also afford that 1/3 end, where it could actually give you control, like over-the-counter access without a prescription. So that's quite a range of options that countries would have, well within the treaty's guidance, to either have cannabis extracts and cannabis preparation and whole cannabis flower in their pharmacy, either as a fairly strongly controlled drug or as a over-the-counter medicine without even the necessity of a prescription. And then oddly enough, there's these 2 little details that actually have been a lot of the last 2 recommendations have been a lot of confusion, a lot of controversy that I didn't really expect. One is a CBD note, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then the other one is just simply moving THC from one treaty to another. And this is what happened. 1961, Harry Anslinger put all this stuff into control and helped maybe the whole world find this omnibus world drug policy that we now are under. But they didn't know about THC. THC hadn't been discovered yet. It was discovered like 3 or 4 years after the 61 treaty. So when they, instead of putting it in the 61 treaty, which would be hard, they had another treaty coming up on psychedelics in 1971. They just stuck it in there. And THC never really belonged in the room with psychedelics in the first place. And it makes no sense to have the active ingredient of the plant material in a different treaty than its plant material. And it's created a lot of work for countries. Honestly, from our assessment, it seems like a lateral move. From moving it from the 1971 treaty to the 1961 treaty seems like it would be about the same level of control that it's on now. Really doesn't seem like it would. And there's some argument about that. There are some activists that we're working with in Europe that think that it would make these Marinol pills or something like that a little bit harder to get. We don't even think so. We think that it might, in the end, cause an hour or 2 of more documentation for countries, because a little more onerous documentation in the one treaty than the other. But that's per year. on this one little thing. I don't think it's a very noticeable thing, and it certainly I don't think it should really hurt patients. The little side note of all that is, as I said before, the 1961 treaty requires a simple majority vote. The 1971 treaty, just to throw more complexity into it, requires a supermajority, a 70% majority,
Wow.
which also increases the likelihood that that particular recommendation might not pass, which then throws a monkey wrench in other suggestions of changes that would rely on THC having been moved. See what I was saying before? And then the last one is CBD note, which this is something that we've inherited from our ancestors. They did know about CBD in 1961. CBD had been discovered earlier in like the 40s, and they chose not to say anything about CBD, even though later they did put THC into control. And they sort of opened up a Pandora's box. The WHO said that they had adequate information to look at CBD and do its own review on its own merits of its own science, and determined it shouldn't be placed in control. So it's not in the treaty now. It's not written in the treaty. Nowhere does it say CBD. And they wanted to put a note in the treaty to make sure people understood that it not being there actually meant that it's not there. You shouldn't consider CBD to be an extract of marijuana and somehow, weasel it into the extracts of marijuana interpretation of the treaty. They're making a note that would essentially say just that if it's CBD meant to be just CBD, it's just got a tiny bit or less of THC in it, or it's just pure CBD, then it would be not subject to control. And again, this is just a clarifying note, but the WHO did say that they recognize there were a lot of cannabinoids that may have medical applications, and as they get evidence to look at those cannabinoids, they'll make a determination on them. So you might, in the end, wind up with 50 notes appended to the treaty because of their lack of foresight back in 1961. But gosh, the how much THC do you allow in your CBD, and what does this note really mean? As what kind of precedent does it set? And Columbia, thankfully, argued two things I think are important to close out this thought. And one is that there was actually precedent and is actually precedent to this note. It's not a new idea to put a note, clarifying note in the treaty. And the other thing I think even more important, they sort of schooled Russia and other countries that were, getting on the WHO's process and complaining about them being political or whatever. In other words, trying to attack them ideologically instead of scientifically. Columbia made it very clear, and I think it's a really beautiful point to make, and that is this is the WHO's job. They're the experts, and you can, as world leaders and countries, vote yes and accept the recommendation, or no and don't accept the recommendation. But you're not in a position to second guess what they said. You don't have the authority or the expertise to judge what they've said. So, they have to make the determination on other factors as well. And in that, they may overrule the WHO, but it wouldn't be on the science that they would be doing it.
Well, that's very interesting. So the vote's coming up in December. So is that in any way to stay on top of that? The information that what comes from that?
Yeah, I gave you before the Crimson Digest. The second document that I'll bring it to your attention is the CND monitor. And that's another thing Kenzie has put together. And you just put his name, Kenzie, with a K, and CND monitor, and I'm sure the Google will bring you right to it. And it has everything you need to know with really cool diagrams of the countries and what we know about their voting position. And you said something about Hungary earlier. That's a really interesting country to talk about, because the European Union is presenting themselves as a bloc, and they've made decisions as a bloc. But there's some discussion right now that leads us to believe that Hungary may break away from that bloc and vote on its own. So that all in itself creates this interesting drama. And there are these little groups of countries, the China, Russia group, and the Asian group, and the African group, and the American, Pan-American group, Latin American groups. It's amazing how these groups, not just the countries, but the groups of countries, interact with each other at this level and create policy. It's sort of how the soup gets made. And very few activists have ever seen the process, and very few reporters report on it. So I thank you for your interest, and commend you on helping getting the word out there.
If someone wants to reach you and contact you, or have input, what's the best way one of our viewers could participate or contact you if you
To
want that?
contact me directly, I'm trying to think of the best way. Right there where the Crimson Digest lives is ResearchGate, and you can find me through there. I'm available on LinkedIn and Facebook. But I think that the way to find your way into the process is maybe even more important. There we have these committees that are set up of us, which we're called non-governmental organizations or NGOs at this level. And our NGOs have an NGO committee, one in New York, the NGO Committee on Drugs, and one in Vienna, the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs. And you can actually go right to their webpage and explore, look at documentation. Also, we have an umbrella organization over in Europe that is worldwide, but it's based in Europe. It's an International Drug Policy Consortium. And you can also access through that umbrella network. They've got a whole bunch of documentation and stuff that you can read and learn about. And a lot of that documentation will teach you about how to enter into the process and how to interact with the UN, how to access the meetings. The meetings will be put up on webcasts. I'm sure that it's like the 5th of December, and I'm sure that one will be a webcast meeting. Hopefully they're still everybody's working the bugs out of communication under COVID, but hopefully that'll work out well. And you go directly to the website. It's the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. UNODC is the secretariat for that commission, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. So if you go into Google and you type Commission on Narcotic Drugs, current meetings this year, it'll bring you right to a web page inside the UNODC that has the links to the different meetings. Click those links, it'll bring you to the documentation from those meetings, and also for future meetings, it'll bring you to the link for the webcast.
All right. Well, I thank you for your continued dedication to our mutual cause, and I look forward to seeing you here in the real world sometime.
Soon. I hope soon.
You're out here on the West Coast, pop on in. Otherwise, maybe somewhere out there on the Hempen Trail.
Absolutely. We'll meet out in the in the cannabis fields.
All right. Sounds fun. Thank you, Michael. Michael Kravitz, working with the World Health Organization and the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Thanks for your efforts. Thanks, our viewers. And remember to restore hemp. Good night.
Think about hemp. Hemp. Industrial hemp. See, I think that the medical marijuana movement will get a lot further if they will reach out and help explain the realities of hemp, the larger issue of hemp. Hemp, medical marijuana. Hemp helps everybody. Hemp helps the earth. Hemp is earth medicine. And I don't see enough awareness being given to hemp as hemp. We're too busy using the medical marijuana for our own enjoyment and to help heal the pain and these different things. But we're ignoring hemp. Hemp will help the planet. Practical reality, if we're going to talk about medicine, all right, we're talking about medical marijuana as medicine for the people, but hemp is medicine for the earth. And if we forget the earth, then we're only going halfway there. Anyway, that's just some attitude, all right? Hemp. Hemp. Industrial hemp. You can build your home out of it. You can make your clothes out of it. And hemp, the CBDs in hemp, all right, are a larger they serve a larger medicinal purpose for the human body than even the THC does. And people need to kind of look at this. Because we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about epilepsy, we're talking about cancer. It's very effective against breast cancer. All right, we're talking about a real deal here, but nobody's paying any attention to it.